Hey JDT, this is Bernard again. Just taking you guys on JavaScript for today. Let's go ahead and get started. So today just going to be about JavaScript and the DOM, and going to talk about what those two are and how to work with those two. So the DOM, it just stands for Document Object Model. So an object model, it's just an object. So the DOM is basically a modeling of the document that exists within the HTML, and specifically looking for how to find a way to get to one point given the tag that you're in. So for example, if I want to get to this tag, right, I would need to go through the body tag and then look for the div tag, and then there it is. It's just another way of structuring your HTML. And it's very important because it allows your JavaScript to target specific parts of your HTML and either manipulate it by adding anything in it. So perhaps if you wanted to add something in here, by the way, this is the code from the other video on HTML CSS. Basically, if you wanted to add another A tag here, you can go through the body and then the div, and then you would need to go through the A tag. So you would just have to go through the div, and then you can add it here. So the reason why it's really important is because it allows your JavaScript to manipulate the HTML and allows them to work together. And it's really just another way of structuring your HTML. Now we understand what document object model is. It's important to understand what element by ID, how to manipulate them. And we do it from the DOM selectors. So an example is document dot get element by ID. An ID is, like we mentioned earlier, it's just a identifier of some tag. So the div tag in here, we give it an ID of links. So if we wanted to perhaps manipulate this div tag and add an object into it, we can say document get element by ID, and the quotation mark would be links, because we want to get this ID. Always give a unique ID for each item that you ever use it for. So never use the same ID for the different tags unless you're wanting to manipulate multiple tags at the same time, or selective tags at the same time. But another way to get an object and manipulate it is document.get element by class name. This is if you have a class name. So if you said class is equal to my button, now we can manipulate this button, not by the ID, but by the class. So in order to do that, we say document.get element by class name, and then in quotation mark would be my button, right? It is case sensitive, so make sure you focus on the capitalization. And then tag name is just the tag. So in this case, I never get an ID to image, so I can just say img, and know that it should target this, and then we can manipulate it in the way that we want. Like I mentioned, so the way to use document.get element by ID, class name, whatever it might be, is you can either set it to a variable, so that way it holds the tag and the information. So if you said let title equal to document get element by ID of title, I don't have an ID title, but imagine if this was title, if that was the ID, then this variable hold this, and it will represent that variable. By the way, variable is just a way of holding value and storing it in some string or some letter or some variable. So we can imagine if a is equal to 20, this a is a variable that holds the value 20. So you can manipulate the inner HTML. You can manipulate the HTML. So if I wanted this to say hello JDT instead of hello world, I would get element by the tag name, which is h1. There's no other h1, so it would know that this is the only h1. And then I could just say dot inner HTML is equal to what I wanted to say. So I could just say dot is equal to hello JDT and this little quotation mark here. You can also manipulate a CSS. So the way to do it is document create element by ID again, pass in the ID name, and then it'll be dot style, and then what you want to change. If you want to change perhaps the color, the border, the cursor, whatever the selector is. If you want to change the property of the color, you can give it a new value. Okay, now let's go into what JavaScript is about. JavaScript is just a language that runs the web. Imagine 95% of the web is actually run by JavaScript. So there's a huge degree of power with JavaScript. So there's examples of basically what is JavaScript, right? It's just another language, just another programming language, and similar to like every other programming language, it can have a bunch of data types. So one of the data types is an integer, which is just a number. So it could be like 1, it could be like 5, it could be like 8, doesn't really matter. It could hold a string, which is just a bunch of letters that hold value of some sort of meaning. And honestly, it's just the way to tell something is a string or not is just by the quotation mark. The first quotation mark word, this right here is a string. Boolean is just either true or false. It's just something that tells us if something is true or false. Null and undefined are basically a way of telling if some value is nothing, or if the value has not been defined yet, has not been created yet. Now, the most important part about JavaScript is the way you create a variable. There's two ways. You can do it from let or const. So let's go ahead and do an example of creating a variable using let and do const. The cool thing about JavaScript is that you can actually just write JavaScript on the browser. You don't need another IDE. You can actually legit write JavaScript right here on any website. You just go to your inspect, right click, and then inspect, and then you go to the console. And in the console, you can actually write a bunch of things. So let's write some JavaScript code where we create a variable using let and const. And now that will give you an example of what the difference is. So let's just say let Bernard equal 10. So what this does is create a variable called Bernard, and that variable holds a value, which is just 10. So what is Bernard? It is 10. What if I wanted to change Bernard to 23? Now, when I type in Bernard, what is Bernard? 23. So it's just like another variable, it can change, and it can change its value. Matter of fact, it can change its own data type. And now it can just say Bernard, right? Bernard is equal to a string Bernard. Now, if I say Bernard, what is Bernard? It's just Bernard. Now, there's a huge difference between let and const. Well, const allows you to create a variable, but so let's just say Jack is equal to 21, right? Now, this is just a variable called Jack with 21. So it's just like any other variable, hold the value. But if you wanted to change Jack to maybe just a string Jack, it says no. Even if you want to change it to a different number, 23, it says no. These are the main reasons. These are two of the main ways to create a variable, but just be aware of how you create it and why sometimes you'll see a lot of mistakes, a lot of bugs coming up when you use the wrong version of creating a variable, either let or const. Basic if-else conditions, similar to the syntax is very similar to JavaScript, Java, C++, and other programming language. It's a little different than Python. In here, when you write an if, you have some condition inside of parentheses and the squiggly bracket, and where inside the squiggly bracket, the code will be executed. And elif just to check to see if there's another condition that is also true. If it is, then this code would run, and then the else is if none of these conditions are true, then we run this code inside this global bracket. So an example is if hungry, right? So if the condition that of hungriness is true inside, and like I said, inside the parentheses, hungry, if it's true, go eat. That could be some function, whatever. But this thing would happen. If it's not true that you're not hungry, then go sleep. Another thing about JavaScript is objects. Very, very important to understand what objects are. Is basically an object is a way of holding information, and its information are inside a key value pair. Meaning this is the key, and this is the value. So this key is like a variable that holds some value, but you can store it inside another variable. So this variable, person, has a bunch of other variables, which is name, age, is happy, programming languages, right? And those values, those variables have some sort of value that you can access. Those are information. So let's go through an example here. So let's create a variable. Let's just say let object class. No, let's just say let class. Let math class equal to some value. So we can say number of students. Imagine it has 50 students. And you can say easy. And then the value could be false. And there is a variable called math class that holds a bunch of information. So if you wanted to know how many students are in the math class, you can say math class dot num of students, and there it is. You get the information, which is 50. What if you wanted to see if the math class is easy? Dot easy, and then we get false. That's just another way of writing an object. The most important thing is there's a key. Sorry. There's a key and there's a value. Before we get into functions, there's something really cool that I want you guys to see on JavaScript. Let's create a variable. Let's say A is equal to 20 and B is equal to 50. Now what's A plus B? 70, right? Because 20 plus 50 is 70. Now check this out. Now B equal to 50, but it's string 50. What is A plus B going to be now? Well, it concatenates it into one new string. So now we have 20, which is just a number, plus the string 50. So it just comes together, joins them together into one new string, 2050, so 2050. It's really interesting. Another thing about Booleans and JavaScript, let's say B is equal to 20. So what is A? A is 20, B is also 20, right? But they're different kinds of 20. A is the integer 20, B is the string 20. But if we say is A equal to B, it says, yeah, it is equal to each other because they have the same value, but they're not the same data type. So if you want to see if these are really, really truly the same thing, we say triple equal sign. Then we see that they're not the exact same thing because one is a string, one is an integer. It's a really cool thing, but be careful to understand the differences between 2 equal sign and 3 equal sign. 2 equal signs says, are these the same thing? It's very unrestricted, and it just checks to see if the values are the same thing. 3 equal signs mean, are they the exact same thing? And are they the exact same data type? And if they are, it returns true. Okay. Writing functions in JavaScript is a little different than what you're probably most used to. There are 3 main ways to write a function. One is just to say function, and then the name of it. It's like Python where you say def, and then write the name of the function. But in JavaScript, you just say function and the name of the function, and then can take in some inputs or not. It's up to you. Another way to do it is to say const. This is the less conventional way, like how you create a variable const and the name of the function is equal to function and then quotation parentheses. The last and probably the most popular way in the industry is just to do what's called an arrow function, where you say const, the name of the function is equal to parentheses and then arrow. For now, we'll just focus on the first version, just because it's a lot more simple to understand for a beginner. So what it is, it's just a function and then the name of the function and whatever the inputs are, and the squiggly bracket. And inside the squiggly bracket is a bunch of your code that will be executed. Yeah. Also, this is one of the coolest things you'll learn in Python in JavaScript, which is console.log. Console.log is the best way to debug. It's just a way of printing your statement and being able to see what's going on and just being able to debug. It allows you to print as you are going through your code and see the status of your variables, see the status of your code, see what's going on, and seeing what comes out of it. So we can console log anything. So console.log, let's say, hello, JDT. And what this does is print hello JDT. You can also say hello console log 20, right? What this does is print 20. It's just a way of seeing something being printed in your console. Cool. All right, we can go ahead and get started on coding with the challenge. So what we're trying to do is just create a little simple counter app that allows you to change the number. So if you press +1, it should update your number to +1. And if you press -1, it should subtract 1. And then if you press reset, it should reset to 0. Okay, so to get started, what we'll do is create a new folder. Let's create a new folder and let's call it JavaScript. Rename JavaScript. Cool. And let's go ahead and open up VS Code and let's open JavaScript. It's in our desktop, JavaScript, open. And let's go ahead and create a HTML. So let's say index.html, create an HTML file. And we can also create a JavaScript file. Let's just call it, not index, why not? Index.js. .js is a way of creating a JavaScript. So just like how .html is for HTML, .js is for JavaScript. Now, let's go ahead and get started with HTML. But first, you'll notice the go live button isn't yet activated. So what we'll do is just close this and then open it again. And we should be able to see the go live button on the bottom right. There it is. Okay, and to get started with HTML, we can just do, VS Code allows us to basically do exclamation point and then press enter, and it gives you the boilerplate template. So, and you can get rid of the meta. You don't need that. And another thing we want to do is connect our HTML and JavaScript together. And to do that, we have to do script. And what we do here is src, which is source, and we connect it to index.js. Now what this does is says, hey, the script, the JavaScript is connected to the JavaScript file index.html, index.js. Cool. Let's go ahead and just build up our little website. Let's start with a simple h1 tag, and let's just call it count. And inside of it, let me refresh. Inside of it, we want to also have our little number. So maybe you can do a simple H3 tag or H4, doesn't really matter. Yeah, H4 is fine. And then we just initialize it to 0. There it is. There's a little count. Matter of fact, let's just go with H2. Cool. Now we want to see what JavaScript can do with this thing, right? With this little DOM. What we can do with this is even target this. So, first let's give this H2 tag an ID. So just ID is equal to number, which is just going to represent this little tag here. And then we can see what it looks like. Let's put it into the variable. Let's just say like count. Let's create a variable called count. What it does, it's just going to get the document, get element by ID. And the ID, like I mentioned, we gave it an ID of number. So we can pass an ID, which is just number. And let's just see what it looks like. So if you want to see what it looks like, you can just go ahead and print it out. To print, it's just console.log count. And what this does is, if you look at the console, you can see the value of it. There it is. It's a tag. It's the H2 tag, and inside of it is the little number. If you want to get the number specifically instead of the tag, you can say dot inner HTML. There it is. There's a little HTML. Another better way to do it is do dot inner text. You can also get the text instead of the whole HTML. So none of the spaces. Number added a bunch of spaces here. So we don't want the whole thing. So we just want the text itself. Okay. So another thing to be aware of is that this is a string. This right here, this 0, is seen as a string. We want to do it convert it into a number. So let's just do number, right? There's a library inside of JavaScript that allows you to convert strings into numbers as they can be converted into a number. And all you have to do is just say number. And there it is. It converts it into a full number. Now this is no longer a string, this is a number. It's just number, parentheses, inside the parentheses, it's just a whole text. And this only works if they actually are a number. Okay, cool. Now let's go ahead and create those little buttons that we wanted. So there's 3 buttons that we want. One that had the +1. We want a button that does the -1. And we want another button that does reset. So if we click these buttons, it does nothing. Also, I want you guys to see what inner HTML can do. We can actually manipulate this HTML here. We can manipulate, perhaps we want to manipulate the count, or even if we want to manipulate the little 0 here, we can say document.get element by ID. The ID is number. And if we said dot inner HTML, we can equal it to whatever we want. So maybe if we want to equal it to 20. There it is. It's a 20 now. If we wanted to equal it to 500, it is 500 now. If we wanted to perhaps make it a string, say hello. There it is. It can change based off of dot inner HTML. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. So what we want to do now is think about how we want to add one, subtract one, and reset the number here. So what we want to do for that is to break it up into 3 types of functions. So we can create a function here that perhaps that does the adding, create another function, maybe that does the subtracting, subtract, and then another function that does the reset. Cool. Each of these functions will do something unique, and what we want to do within those functions is up to us, but The most important thing is we want to manipulate count, and we want to manipulate it by adding it by 1 in this case. So let's just say count is equal to count plus 1. So in this case, imagine if count is equal to 0, then count is equal to 0 plus 1. 1. Now the new count is equal to 1. So count used to be 0. Now if we add plus 1 by itself, it's just 0 plus 1, and now count is equal to 1. Now we update the count by 1. We increment it by 1. We can display that. So we can say document.get element by ID, which is just number, and then dot inner HTML equal to the new count. What this allows us to do is basically manipulate the HTML and add it up by 1. Okay, let's test this out. If we click the button +1, it should call that function. Now, how do we make this function get called by clicking the button? The best way to do that is through what's called onClick. So there's an event emitter where it says that this button gets clicked, then we will do something. In this case, we just add. We call this function add when this button is clicked. So let's just go ahead and press the 1, and there it is. It's adding it. It is manipulating, so it goes to this function when we click that button, and what it does is look for the count and updates it by adding it by 1, and then sets this number as the new count. We're going to do the same thing for subtract. So count is equal to count itself minus 1. Reset is just count is equal to 0. And then everything else is just going to be the same code, which is document get element by ID. So document get element by ID number, and then dot inner HTML is equal to count. And same thing here. Document dot get element by ID number dot inner HTML is equal to count. Same code. Now it's about connecting these buttons to that function. So when this is on click, the negative one, we should call the subtract function. And on click of the reset button, we should call on the reset button, the reset function. So +1, there it is. And then reset, set it to 0. There it is. There's your little HTML and CSS, HTML and JavaScript. Cool. Hope you guys enjoyed.